And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome aboard. I'm National Weather Service Meteorologist Peter Chan with your marine weather outlook here as we head into the weekend. And before we get into what's coming up here, let's quick check the sea ice. The ice continues to melt off rather rapidly now along the Arctic coast. The ice has become rather rotten and soft, so it's going to melt quickly here as we head over the next several days in this trend for opening water across the Beaufort Sea and Arctic Ocean will only increase as we do not expect to reach minimum sea ice extent until sometime around mid-September. Well, we are watching a brewing storm system that's going to impact the Gulf this weekend. Right now, we have a weak area of low pressure in the western Gulf, not amounting to too much, and another low that's out here in the central Bering. But what we're watching is a stronger piece of energy and a low that's going to come out of the North Pacific, track northeastward well south of the Alaska Peninsula, and then end up just east of Kodiak City on Saturday over the western Gulf. And this system is going to have gale force winds along with a moderate to heavy rainfall along areas of the Gulf Coast and Panhandle. So by Friday afternoon, here comes a 980 low with a warm front extending out ahead of it. And we're going to see some of the stronger winds, especially here through the western and northwestern Gulf, arrive very late Friday night in the pre-dawn hours of Saturday morning and then into Saturday morning, early afternoon. By Saturday mid-afternoon, the low center will be located just east of Kodiak and in the western Gulf with an occluded front arcing out ahead of it along the northern and northeastern Gulf Coast, pushing into the Panhandle. And along this front, we expect gale force winds. There could be locally some higher gusts to near storm force in some areas where you get any type of funneling or just along the frontal boundary as well, what we call a barrier jet. And then also inflow of moist air creating moderate to locally heavy rainfall, some pretty hefty rains falling around the eastern Kenai, Cordova on eastward, Yakutat, and in through parts of the Panhandle. A few areas could receive over 3 inches of rainfall with the system by the time things wind down late in the weekend, later on Sunday. But ahead of it on Friday, look for southeast winds 15 knots across the inner channels, waves just 2 to 3 feet. South to southeast winds 15 to 20 knots along the outer Gulf Coast and within 15 nautical miles of shore, waves generally 5 to 6 feet. But as that frontal boundary pushes up along the Panhandle here, we expect winds to increase 25 to 30 knots. We could even see gusts to 40-knot gale force winds here in through the middle channel, Stevens Passage. The outer coast, south winds turning more easterly, generally 30 knots with some higher gusts above into gale force. And we have sustained, expect gale force winds to 45 knots possible there near and south of Cape Suckling, and waves building 15 feet plus. Now, across the northwestern Gulf on Friday, relatively quiet, especially through the morning, early afternoon. Easterly winds 10 knots, Prince William Sound, just 2-foot waves. Northeast to north winds 10 to 15 knots down the length of Cook Inlet with waves 3, maybe 4 feet toward the entrance, but it's going to really rock and roll on Saturday. Look at east-northeast winds in the Gulf waters, 45 knots with waves 15 feet plus. Easterly winds 30 knots, Prince William Sound with at least 7-foot waves, and middle lower Cook Inlet gale force north winds of 35 knots and waves 10 to 13 feet. Now across Kodiak Islands Friday, winds are going to be rather variable with that approaching system, but generally northeasterly to start, picking up 20-25 knots, especially through Shelikof Strait. North Pacific side waves right around 4 feet or so. Northeast winds 15 to 20 knots on the Bering side, 15 knots out of Bristol Bay, 2 to 3 foot waves. And then for Saturday, you can see surrounding Kodiak Island, just on the backside of low, you can see north winds of 40 knots, waves 14, 16 feet there through Shelikof Strait. Winds turn northwesterly, westerly, and then back to the southwest as we get out toward the eastern Aleutians. So the strongest winds will be focused up here east of Chiknik and especially surrounding and just east of Kodiak Island on Saturday. Across the Aleutians, northeast winds 15 knots in the vicinity of Unalaska, variable Nikolsky around 10 knots, and then west to northwest winds 15, picking up to 20 to 25 knot northwest winds, especially Kiska westward to Shimia. And for Saturday, look for westerly winds 15 knots there through the eastern Aleutians, variable 10 knots around Nikolsky, Atka, but trying to turn back toward the west and then north out across the far western Aleutians at 15 knots. Along the southwest coast, northeast winds out of Bristol Bay at 10 knots, north winds out of Kuskokwim Bay at 15 knots with waves just a couple of feet there. And then across Norton Sound and off of the lower Yukon Delta, we expect north winds generally around 15 knots and waves a few feet. For Saturday, though, with that strong low in place in the western Gulf, we expect northwest winds 20 to 25 knots, Kuskokwim and Bristol Bays with waves 3-4 feet. Generally north winds 15 to 20 knots crossing Norton Sound and along the outer Yukon Delta, and maybe a bit stronger through Etolan Strait. Otherwise just variable winds 10 knots much further west there toward St. Paul, where waves will be around 4 feet. Along the Arctic coast, we're anticipating east-northeast winds 15 knots, but increasing and accelerating 25 to 30 knots once you get southwest of Wainwright, northeast winds to 30 knots off of Cape Lisburne and Point Hope with waves as high as 6 to 8 feet there. Turning back to the west 10 to 15 knots into Kotzebue Sound on Friday, and generally northwest to north winds once you get through the Bering Strait on the north side of St. Lawrence Island with waves of 2 to 3 feet. Looking ahead to Saturday, north to northeast winds 5 to 10 knots across the Arctic coast, waves a foot or two. Still stronger to the west of Wainwright and down off of Cape Lisburne. Northeast winds to 25 knots. They remain northerly. And generally look for north winds through the Bering Strait at 20 knots with waves running 4 to 5 feet. So stay tuned to later forecast on the latest regarding marine and aviation weather, especially with that stronger storm system that will impact the Gulf Coast and Panhandle here as we get into Saturday.